The fields are all white, the harvest is near, the reapers are with their sharp sickles appear.
Misconceptions regarding the scope and geographical focus of biblical prophecy. For many years, it has been taught that in the last days, literally every nation of the earth will be utterly dominated by the Antichrist, that there will be no place to escape from the dreaded mark of the beast, that every last nation on the world will come against Jerusalem. Zechariah 12 is used to validate the theory. All the nations of the earth will be gathered together to attack Jerusalem. Later in Zechariah 14 we read that God will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The prophet Joel prophesies similarly, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. The Apostle John, using perhaps the strongest language of all, goes so far as to say that the Antichrist will be given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. This would seem as an ironclad case for the Antichrist ruling the entire world, which he uses in the march against Jerusalem. However, the word used for earth in Zechariah is eretz, which most often is translated as land. But there are many verses in the Bible that also use this same type of language, yet are all clearly not speaking of the whole globe per se. This type of language is actually found quite frequently in the Bible. For instance, Daniel the prophet, speaking of King Nebuchadnezzar, O King the Most High, God gave your father, Nebuchadnezzar, sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men, every language, dreaded and feared him. Did every single nation in the earth fear Nebuchadnezzar's father? Or did only those nations that had heard of Nebuchadnezzar's father dread him? Was Daniel speaking of every nation of the whole earth? Or only those nations that were in close enough proximity to Babylon to be affected by her? Were the native peoples of Hawaii or Denmark living in dread of Nebuchadnezzar's father? Of course not. Daniel's use of the phrase all the peoples and nations and men of every language was more of an emphatic expression used to convey his point. There are numerous examples like this through the whole Bible. Let's return to the passage in Zechariah 12 and read it in full context. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to remove it will injure themselves. Who does this passage specifically say will attack Jerusalem? The answer is the surrounding peoples. Today, the nations that encircle Israel on every side are Muslim. The prophet Joel confirms this as well. Speaking of a final attack against Jerusalem, Joel prophesied, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people, my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided my land. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, for there I will sit and judge all these surrounding nations. Ezekiel, for instance, also specifies who the nations are that will attack Israel and incur God's judgment at the end of the age. O mountains of Israel, This is what Jehovah the Sovereign says to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys, to the desolate ruins and the deserted towns that have been plundered and ridiculed by the rest of the nations around you. This is what Jehovah the Sovereign says. In my burning zeal I have spoken against the rest of the nations, against all Edom, for with glee and with malice in their hearts they made my land their own possession, so that they might plunder its pasture land. Then the nations that are left round about you will know that I, Jehovah, have rebuilt the ruined places and planted that which was desolate. I, Jehovah, have spoken and will do it. Notice the pattern. First, there is specific mention of the nations around you. Then one of them is named Edom, while Edom is used as a general term referring to the enemies of the Jews who lived to the east of Israel. Today this would most specifically be Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The Bible makes every effort to clarify the nations round about. Another reason the position that every nation will fall to Antichrist is impossible is the fact that some will resist the Antichrist and even attack him. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. The Bible says many countries, not all. Elsewhere we read that Kittim will come against him. Daniel 11:30 says that ships of Kittim, often translated as out of the west, will come against the king of the north, the Antichrist. For the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Josephus identifies Kittim as Cyprus. The name was first used to identify the Phoenician port of Kitium in Cyprus. In fact, Kittim actually appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls and is even translated as Romans in the Septuagint. In general, the term Kittim was used to refer to all the islands and settlements along the sea coasts, as well as to the people who had succeeded them when the Phoenician power decayed. Thus, Kittim generally refers to the islands and coasts of the Mediterranean and the races that inhabit those areas. Note that none of these lands are Muslim. If the Antichrist were to come from the Western Roman Empire or Europe, the ships of Kittim would not come against him. To answer the question, are any European nations mentioned in the Bible? Well, yes. The ships of Kittim in the Septuagint are literally the European nations from Cyprus to Italy, even to Spain. According to the prophecy of Daniel 11, they attacked Antiochus, who was a foreshadow of the Antichrist. As such, this passage could very well involve a dual fulfillment, and we could have a prophecy about a European attack against the forces of the Antichrist. Consider Turkey's army. It supersedes the combined forces of Great Britain, Italy, and France combined. Yet Turkey is no match for Rome's fleet. Our fleet cannot perhaps compare with the fleet of Italy, but our army is mighty, explains Ziya Basha, Turkey's ambassador to the United States. Turkey's army is stronger, but Italy's fleet can defeat Turkey. No European country is featured in end times prophecy as receiving a judgment of wrath. Rome, for example, is mentioned several times and Spain twice, without a single reference to judgments. Ezekiel 28 also confirms that the most powerful nations on earth will attack the Antichrist. Behold, therefore I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile thy brightness. The term terrible implies not ugly or awful, but very powerful in battle. That is, terrible in battle. God will rise up several nations to attack the Antichrist. Therefore, it cannot be true that every nation of the earth will fall to the Antichrist and attack Israel. There have always been attempts to establish a one-world government, yet they have never succeeded. Why? Because God already in Genesis established that the nations will always be divided, and the devil can never combine the entire earth and the entire globe under his command, because God ordained it as such.